Thank you. So when Wendy sent me that blurb, she sent me an email and she said, here's a blurb, change anything you want. I don't know if you'll like it. But of course, it was the most amazing blurb ever that really captures not only the fact that Wendy understands my work really well, but she's also been a mentor to me for the past 10 years. And the first time I met her was right before the summer of 2009. And that was actually the first time I went to the field. And the reason I was able to initially get contacts with the MST, I had written them a bunch of times, their International Relations Collective, but it wasn't until I emailed one of Wendy's friends in the movement, Saleche, that suddenly the International Relations Collective got back to me, and then everything else was history. So thank you so much, Wendy, for being here. Thanks to Ken for hosting also. I'm really excited to be talking to a graduate student Latin American Studies conference because I was a graduate student not so long ago, and the research I'm going to present about is research from my dissertation. That became a book, so now you all know it's possible to turn your dissertation into a book. And it's much more fulfilling, I think, than a lot of articles because you can actually give it to people and sign it, and so it is possible. And so as Wendy alluded to, this book is broadly about the relationship between education, social movements, and the state. And I didn't get interested in this topic as an academic, but rather as an activist embedded in the student movement, the anti-war movement, and the anti-sweatshop movement as an undergraduate. And so when I was a junior in college at the University of Michigan, I had the opportunity to go to Brazil for the first time. And in Brazil, I began to work with a feminist organization in the northeast of the country whose goal was to end all forms of racism, sexism, and class oppression, which I thought was a pretty good goal, right? And so I asked the founder of this organization, Lourdes, how she planned to do that. And she pointed to a picture of a person. Can anyone guess who she pointed to?
The kid.
What?
The kid.
The kid? No, not the kid. Paulo Freire, right? So this organization, Grupo Mulher Maravilha, Group Wonder Woman, was using the ideas that Paulo Freire developed in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed in order to raise the critical consciousness of people in the community. And so I watched that summer as women, as the organization would gather elder women to, for example, read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and then discuss whether they actually had those rights in their community, and if not, what to do about it. And so I became obsessed at a very young age of the idea of education as a pedagogy of social change. And I wondered why our own movements in the United States didn't have the same types of grassroots educational programs. And so I decided to go to graduate school at UC Berkeley to understand more social movement-led educational alternatives. But when I got to my program in social and cultural studies and education, rather than read about educational alternatives, all we did was read theory after theory after theory about why the public education is actually an oppressive institution that simply reproduces the same economic and racial inequities. And so I began to think, is it possible for public schools to have these radical educational pedagogies that I had observed in Northeast Brazil? And so my dissertation, which became this book, looked at this question about how social movements can use public institutions, public education, as part of their larger social and economic goals. And so broadly, the driving question of the book is how can and do social movements work within, through, and outside of the state to promote their broader social and economic goals? And what is the role of public education in processes of social reproduction and resistance? The big take-home point, the big lesson that I learned from this research, and the big take-home point for all of you today, is that transforming schools is really just one part of a much broader strategy that Brazilian social movements have embraced over the past 4 decades. These movements aren't simply moments of protest, as our movements are in the United States often, but rather they're really sophisticated organizations and collectivities embedded in national and international networks. And these movements do not simply contest the state, but rather they work with and through the state in what German activist Rudi Dusky, drawing on Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, referred to as the long march through the institutions. So the long march through the institutions is when social movement leaders engage in the long march when they enter the state, helping to carry out the daily job of public service provision while linking those actions to a broader process of social struggle and a long-term strategy for economic and political change. This means contesting power in all state spheres, whether that's schools, universities, healthcare clinics, sanitation centers, or local governance. In other words, social movements in Brazil have gained tremendous power by working with and through the state to promote their economic and social vision in all spheres that affect people's daily lives. And I argue in this book that this long march through the institutions is the reason why social movements have been able to maintain their organizations and their relevance for the past 4 decades. And of course, the social movement that most embodies this long march strategy is the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, or the MAST, the MST. So I know this is a Latin Americanist crowd, but raise your hand if you've heard of the MST before. Okay, so lots of people, not everyone. I'll just give a brief history of the movement. As many of you know, the movement emerged in the late 1970s in order to contest unequal land distribution throughout Brazil. It did not emerge as a united movement, but rather dispersed attempts of landless farmers who were inspired by liberation theology, the Catholic Church, and the CPT that Diogo talked about. And these farmers decided to take the issue of poverty into their own hand and occupy large, unproductive land estates. Even during a period of dictatorship, this tactic of land occupation actually worked, and the government gave land access to these families. So in 1984, the leaders of these different land occupations throughout southern Brazil came together, and they decided to form a national movement, the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, with the phrase, "The land belongs to those who work it." The movement has grown to have 1.5 million women, men, and children, with 350,000 families that now have land rights. The movement continues to occupy land to this day. And in fact, you can't really see this picture, but this is a picture of a land occupation that I participated in 2011, when right before the activists broke through the gates, they shouted to me, Rebecca, jump the fence and take a picture." And so I was actually able to jump the fence and take this incredible picture of a land occupation in process. Currently, the movement articulates its goals in terms of land reform, agrarian reform, and social transformation. Although access to land is one aspect of agrarian reform, the movement likes to separate out those goals because getting land does not actually allow you to live a dignified life on the land, by which you need also resources like roads and houses, technical assistance, and of course, schools. The movement's fight for social transformation is its most polemic goal, as the movement openly critiques capitalism and embraces historical attempts to construct socialism. This goal of social transformation has also evolved over the past 3 decades to include indigenous rights and gender equity and racial justice, and most recently over the past 5 years, LGBTQ working class rights. Education is a critical component of achieving all of these goals. And although the MST's signature issue is agrarian reform, land reform, I would argue that the MST's transformation of the rural public school system might end up being its longest lasting legacy. Over the past 30 years, the movement has gotten access to more than 2,000 schools with 8,000 teachers and 250,000 students. All of these schools are run by state and municipal governments. And some of them actually allow MST activists to engage in the co-governance of these schools, implementing pedagogies that encourage youth to stay in the countryside, promote collectivity, agroecology, and more collective forms of work. In addition, the movement has partnered with more than 80 higher education institutions to create adult education, high school, and higher education degree programs across the country, affecting hundreds of thousands of students. These programs are what you could call affirmative action programs for land occupation participants, because you can only enter one of these programs if you have gotten access to land through a land occupation, you or your parents, or if you're currently occupying land. These programs have transformed the landless workers movement in 20 years from a movement of farmers with 5th, 6th, 7th grade education to a movement of farmers with college education and beyond. So those are some tremendous accomplishments, right? And more so, they go against a lot of the literature, the dominant literature. Specifically, in the sociology of social movements, there's an argument that tends to be that social movements inevitably become more conservative and less effective as they institutionalize. This goes back, of course, to Michel's argument about the iron rule of oligarchy, that organizations become more and more oligarchical over time, and Piven and Cloward's argument that disruption is the most, and if not only, form of effective protest. Of course, lots and lots of scholars have created more nuanced arguments since then. Sonia Alvarez talks about the dual strategy of working within and outside of the state. Jonathan Fox talks about the sandwich strategy of working with the state. Patrick Heller talks about how the Communist Party in Kerala really institutionalized redistributive reforms. And a recent book by Tiana Paschel is an amazing book that shows how the Black movements in Brazil and in Colombia were actually able to make humongous transformations within the state and do great affirmative action policies in the case of Brazil and land titling programs in Colombia. And of course, you're all Latin Americanists, so you know that there's a huge body of literature on participatory democracy in Latin America that has argued over and over and over again that Latin American activists have demanded direct avenues for state participation while also defending their autonomy in relationship to the state. So again, lots of nuanced arguments. Nonetheless, I would argue that this question of how social movements should engage the state continues to vex academics and activists. Let's take the Zapatistas. Many people embrace the Zapatistas for choosing a strategy the opposite of the MST and creating institutions outside of the realm of the state. The Occupy movement basically fractionalized over the question of whether to make demands on the state or whether to create the perfect social world within the confines of Zuccotti Park. The Chilean student movement has also had lots of intense debates about their relationship to electoral politics. And in Brazil, the MST itself is highly critiqued by leftist party leaders for its relationship with the Workers' Party. And many of these leftists would say that the MST has indeed been co-opted, giving up its ability to organize large land occupations for the crumbs of the neoliberal state. So again, I would argue that 40 years after Piven and Cloward's polemic against the institutionalization of social movements, the question of how social movements should engage the state continues to be the central dilemma for 21st century movements. Nonetheless, so just for education folks out there, like the question of schools and reproduction continues to be a really big issue. But these concerns about engaging the state and this worry about state-society relations does not actually explain this picture. So in this picture, what you're looking at is a public school. It's a public school that the MST has gotten legal recognition to exist within an illegal occupied encampment. More so, the movement has gotten permission for this school to move with the movement of the movement. Or in other words, in this case, the movement is marching on the Capitol to demand more resources, and the school is legally allowed to march with the march. So in this case, you have a school that continues to be a public institution that's actually increasing the mobilization of a movement against that very same state. And I don't know if this looks more like the state co-opting the MST or the MST co-opting the state, right? So back to the book. The big contribution I'm trying to make to the theorization of social movements is a move away on the one hand of an idealization of protest as the only effective form of social movement action, and also away on the other hand of an uncritical embracing of state negotiation. Instead, I try to promote the positive theory of what I call contentious co-governance, which is when social movements engage in the provision of public services with state actors while simultaneously organizing contentious political actions and promoting practices that come into conflict with institutional norms and the interests of the state itself. In other words, negotiation is not enough, and neither is protest. You need both of these things over and over and over again, as I'm going to try to show in my talk today. A second argument I make is that contentious co-governance isn't just good to get demands met, but it actually increases the internal capacity and long-term relevance of social movements. And third, contentious co-governance does not only happen in left-leaning regimes, but rather it can take place in diverse political and economic contexts, including in right-wing and conservative governments. I also make some specific arguments about education, about how formal schools are strategic trains for social movements to garner influence. I can talk more about the educational arguments afterwards, because I know this is more of a Latin American crowd here. But I make all these arguments based on 20 months of ethnographic research. This research was in 5 parts of the country. For every single day of these 20 months, I actually lived in the homes of MST educational activists, and I participated in all of the activities of the movement that have to do with education. This was teacher trainings, daily school days, higher education programs, state society meetings, activist strategy sessions. I also interviewed 200 people. Half of those were activists and half of those were state officials in order to understand the shifting relationships between state and civil society. Again, this is a multi-sided political ethnography because I looked at state movement relations at different levels and in different locations. I did research in 3 state-administered school systems in São Paulo, Rio Grande do Sul, and Ceará, and 2 municipal-administered school systems in the state of Pernambuco. I looked at both cases of success, where the MST was able to transform schools, and also cases that were much more difficult, where the movement's gains were suddenly reversed, or where they never had any gains in the school system, or where their participation was marginalized. And so I tried to look at sort of different cases across the country. It's a very long book. It's not short, it's very long, because I try to trace the trajectory of one social movement over 35 years in 5 different locations and at the national level, which involves hundreds of schools and dozens of educational programs. So to break down the book for you a little, the first half of the book really talks about how the MST constructed a national educational program that supported its values, and then the trajectory of this program at the national level. And the second part of the book is where I talk about the 5 regional cases. And this is where I really get into nitty-gritty of how the MST interacts with different politicians of different ideological tendencies and implements their goals throughout the country. Today, however, for the rest of the time I have, I'm just going to talk about one chapter of the book, chapter 2. And this chapter talks about one particular national educational program, Pronera, which is the National Program for Education in Areas of Agrarian Reform. I'm going to focus on Pronera because I think that Pronera really emphasizes my point that social movements' co-governance of public institutions is a constant process of political contestation. In particular, I'm going to talk about 3 struggles that surrounded Pronera. The first is massive protest and state openings. The second is finding local allies and keeping them. And the third is defending institutional gains. So with that, I'm going to bring us to the mid-1990s in Brazil, just for a little background. And a point for anyone who can say who that person is in the middle of the left picture. Anyone? Yeah, it's a very, very old Paulo Freire, right? So just to give you a background about the mid-1990s, by the mid-1990s, the landless workers movement had already developed dozens and dozens of educational programs across the country. This included massive literacy programs, childcare programs, and also probably most impressively, the movement's own high school in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul that offered people both a high school degree and a technical degree in teaching or agroecology cooperative administration. And so if you were an activist in the early 1990s and you didn't have a high school degree, the MST would quickly ship you off to the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul, where you can get a high school degree through the MST's alternative educational approach. And so by 1996, the MST was able to publish a comprehensive document called the MST's Educational Principles, which really described both the movement's pedagogical and philosophical principles of education, which again, I'm not going to focus on right now, but I'm happy to talk about in questions and answers. Nonetheless, in the mid-1990s, very few MST activists held a college degree. Although these activists were constantly studying complex theories in non-formal educational programs, in the eyes of the Brazilian state, they were still just high school graduates. And so I talked to one activist who told me why it was important for her and for the movement to get higher education. Rubenusa told me, when you are in the movement, you're an activist 24 hours a day. You're always at the disposal of the movement. It is hard to fit the routine of formal education because you would have to stop your activism to study. Lots of people were doing this, leaving the movement because we had reached a ceiling for the level of education that activists could attain. The professors at universities would also not respect us. We had hit a limit because we did not have higher education. However, we did not want to study in any type of university. We started to analyze how we could offer higher education to our activists. And so with this challenge that the MST faced in the mid-1990s, we get to our first struggle, which is a struggle for massive protest, which is a struggle around massive protest and state openings. So in the mid-1990s, globally, but especially in Latin America, governments were really embracing neoliberal reforms that were slashing tariffs, that were eliminating social programs, and that were opening up local markets to international investment. And so despite any of Fernando Henrique Cardoso's previous dependence theory tendencies, when he was elected president in 1995, he really embraced this monetary and fiscal approach. In addition, or in response, what the landless workers movement did is they began to organize massive land occupations throughout the country. And although Fernando Henrique had said he supported agrarian reform, once he was the president, he began critiquing these occupations, which emboldened a lot of local elites. So on April 17th, 1996, in the northern state of Pará, military police opened fire on a march of MST activists, killing 19 activists, in what became known as the Massacre of Eldorado dos Carajás. This massacre was caught on camera, which completely enraged people internationally and ironically increased a wave of support for agrarian reform. The following February, the MST organized the National March for Agrarian Reform, with thousands of activists leaving from 3 corners of the country and marching to the capital of Brasilia, arriving in Brasilia April 17th, 1997, the 1-year anniversary of the massacre, with 100,000 people. With this support, President Cardoso had to respond. And so by the end of his administration, he actually redistributed more land to landless families than the combination of presidents in the entire decade before. These national mobilizations also had an effect for the educational struggle. As MST national leader Edgar Colling told me, education got a free ride, a corona, on the tail of these national mobilizations. On April 17th, 1998, President Cardoso signed into law the National Program for Education in Areas of Agrarian Reform. So in other words, it was not a leftist government, but conflict and bloodshed that led to the MST's most important educational victory. Which brings us to our second struggle, which is finding local allies and keeping them. Pronera was initially intended to be a literacy program, and indeed it increased funding for literacy programs across the country. However, the MST was not satisfied. They wanted to use Pronera to renew their search for higher educational access. And so activists in the movement went to dozens of public universities across the country saying, we have funding. Will you all, our allies in the universities, organize an undergraduate course for us in pedagogy through Pronera? everyone said, no, no way, you're crazy. And so Edgar Colleen, this national MST leader, he really interpreted that negatively. He said that although these universities invited them to talk about their literacy programs, the idea that Senteja, that landless people could come to the university to study as peers, was intolerable. And so the MST's search for higher education access might have ended there in 1998, if not for a very small private university in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul, known as the University of Ijuí. This university had a long history of working with social movements. And because of this, the professors were enthusiastic about the idea of creating an undergraduate program specifically in partnership with the MST through Pronera. And so in 1998, the first ever higher education Pronera program began, known as the Pedagogy of Land program. 47 MST activists from 15 states attended the program. And this progressive institution ended up being the perfect context for the MST to try out their educational approach in the university sphere. First, the movement convinced the professors to organize the course through the pedagogy of alternation, where the students would come and study intensely for 2 months and then return to their communities to engage in community research projects. In addition, the course engaged in student self-governance, collective work, collaborative living, the integration of disciplines, manual labor, and social struggle. So for example, to integrate the disciplines, every semester the movement would choose one general theme, like agroecology or gender and work. And then the activists would try to take their courses and relate all of their courses to that one overarching theme. In order to practice student self-governance, the cohort divided in what were called base nuclei, where they would engage in governing all the aspects of the course that were needed, like cooking and cleaning, but also the more pedagogical aspects of the course. As Rosalie Caldarci told me, who's another MST leader, she said the base of the course was the university's curriculum, but all of the extras, the spices, were from the movement. So the course kept going, and even though there was lots of opportunities, there were a series of tensions that emerged. First, there were professors who just refused to change their teaching practice. There were disputes over who had the right to define the curriculum. And there were also conflicts between the students, in particular one student who no longer wanted to engage in the collective work. And so the professors supported his decision to enroll in a regular pedagogy program. Activist Elizabeth, reflecting on this, told me, it was then that we realized that the university did not understand us or our proposal because they supported and valued his decision 100%. So again, conflicts, but the course kept going for 4 years. And it wasn't until the last semester that a conflict emerged that could not be overcome. Specifically, in the early 2000s, the Ministry of Education in Brazil began requiring a ranking system among all private and public universities, which required students to take a standardized test. The national student movement decided to boycott the exam. But for the professors at the University of Ijuí who had gone out on a limb to support the MST in their program, this test was extremely important for the course to have national legitimacy. The MST activists gathered and they debated and they decided they were going to support the boycott. To put salt on the wound, they went to take the exam and they left all of the exams blank, which resulted in a failing grade for all of the tests with deep repercussions for the professors at the University of Ijuí. The professors were outraged. One of them told me they did not allow anyone to know about their decision. There was no dialogue. Another said, we agreed to work with the practices of the movement. We did what the movement wanted, but the movement refused to work with the practices of the universities. The MST never developed another Pronera program at the University of Ijuí. So some of you look like a little shocked. But actually, based on sort of what I'm arguing here and what I think the MST shows, these conflicts should have been expected, right? Because these conflicts are what I'm calling contentious co-governance. when social movements engage in the provision of public services with state actors, while simultaneously organizing contentious political actions and promoting practices that come into conflict with institutional norms and the interest of the state itself. And I would argue that these types of conflicts are going to happen even under left-leaning governments and in progressive institutions, because the goals of a self-declared socialist movement are always going to conflict with the norms and the practices of institutional governance in an individualistic, meritocratic, capitalist society. And so these conflicts are really normal and a continuous thing that will happen. But don't worry, despite these conflicts, the University of Ujui really opened a door to higher education for the MST, because over the next decade, dozens and dozens and dozens of public universities decided that they also wanted to develop Pronera programs with the MST. Then in 2003, with the election of left-leaning President Lula, Pronera funding just spiked, which led to dozens and dozens of more higher education programs throughout the country. By 2011, 3,323 students had graduated from 52 different university programs. Again, this is surprising because Pronera was initially intended to be a literacy program, not an affirmative action program for land occupation participants. Yet what the MST did is they used Pronera as a wedge to open doors into the higher educational sphere. Thus, this thing that we as academics are always calling institutionalization was not a passive monolithic process, but rather an active struggle, one of ongoing contestation, setbacks, and advances. The types of Pronera programs totally expanded over the next decade, where you'd have programs in agronomy, literature, math, even an undergraduate program in law. And you'd also have graduate level programs in adult education, family agriculture, infant education. And just go here. And even though the students who entered these programs got a normal university degree, the education experience they had was extremely different. So for example, in an undergraduate program on geography, students would learn about the geography of Brazil, economic geography, and they'd also learn about territorial rural development and production alternatives for the Brazilian countryside, public policies and agrarian rights, and the management of natural resources and studies of environmental impacts. Similarly, in the degree program in law, students would learn about constitutional law, judiciary systems, but they'd also learn about historical and social context of legal systems, agrarian law from a peasant perspective, and legal struggles of non-capitalist countries. In addition, all of these Pronera programs allowed for a connection between theory and practice through research, because students would come and study together for a few months and then return to their communities to do community research projects. So for example, students in the infant education program, one community period, they were asked to interview the people in their community about their social values and build playgrounds that epitomize those social values. Another student in a pedagogy program for his final project got young people in the community to collect empty tin cans and produce a band called the Banda de Lata, the tin can band, and then he theorized about that process in his final project. All students who go through Pronera programs have to do this implementation of theory through practice by first investigating their local reality and then creating an intervention to intervene in it. Finally, the program also got institutionalized as something called triple governance, which I can talk more in the question and answer. But basically, legally, you had to have 3 partners to run a program, which was the federal government, a university, and a social movement. Pronera has definitely increased the internal capacity of the MST. As MST national leader Jean Pedro Stedgley said, Pronera is one of our most valuable experiences we have. It is a fighting against ignorance throughout the Brazilian countryside. Another leader said, these educational programs are pedagogical laboratories. They are privileged spaces because in no other space are activists together for an extended period of time discussing and creating theories for the movement. And my favorite quote from Maria de Jesus, who was in that first University of Ijuí program, she told me, now we have pedagogues, agronomists, lawyers, journalists, all of these professions in the countryside that are important for the working class. Again, Pronera in a short decade transformed the MST's leadership from a movement of leaders with high school education to a movement of leaders with college education and beyond. And it is exactly this ability for Pronera to contribute to the internal capacity of the movement that has led it to have lots of external attacks, which brings us to our final struggle, which is the struggle to defend institutional gains. So in 2005, 2006, the MST reached out to the State University of Mato Grosso and started a Pronera bachelor degree in agronomy. Then around 2008, a student in the program decided that he no longer wanted to do any of the things the MST was demanding in the program. And furthermore, he decided to condemn the program. And he wrote a letter to the Federal Court of Audits, which is the conservative auditing body of the Brazilian Congress, the TCU, complaining about the MST's influence. The Federal Court of Audits investigated the program, and on 2008, November 19th, they issued a scathing judgment saying that Pronera was being administered without a public call or open selective process, which allows professors to be chosen by an organization that is external to public oversight, the MST, which abuses the principles of impartiality and morality. They had somewhat of a point here, right? But instead of closing down these programs, what the Federal Court of Audits did is they put a series of regulations on the program. First, they said Pronera had to be administered through contracts. They put a ban on paying university professors in the program. And probably the worst one is that they prohibited the participation of social movements. So although they did not shut down Pronera, they basically paralyzed it from having any more programs in the future. So what do you all think the MST did in response? Any guesses? Find another program? Come on. They protested, right? For the next 2 years, the MST engaged in an intense process of mobilization of the movement against the state to critique these policies and these regulations. However, interestingly, by 2008, the movement that MST was mobilizing now included hundreds and hundreds of professors across the country who initially hadn't supported the MST, but through their experience with the program had come to believe that Pronera was extremely important for offering higher educational access to poor rural youth. And so the culmination of 2 years of mobilizations happened on November 2010, the fourth national seminar in Pronera, where there were 600 graduates and professors who had participated in programs. There was dozens of congressional reps, and there were 59 university provosts, the importance of provosts, Wendy, 59 university provosts who signed a declaration supporting Pronera that stated, "We are thinking about the social role of the university. The Federal Courts of Audits is being absurd. Forcing a contract bidding process is ridiculous, not possible. Education is not a commodity. The central question is the autonomy of the university." Then, a day later, President Lula shakes the hand of MST activist Wander Lucia Simplicio and signs a presidential decree supporting Pronera, turning Pronera into a national law and explicitly stating that social movements are allowed to participate. Under this pressure, the Federal Court of Audits had to respond. And so just a few weeks later, on December 1st, the TCU issued a new judgment lifting all of these Pronera restrictions, which led to dozens and dozens of more higher education programs over the next 5 years. So, in conclusion, Pronera really illustrates two major arguments of my book, this particular chapter. One is that the story shows how Pronera's creation and expansion shows that social movements' effective participation in formal institution requires a combination of political advocacy and contentious protest. I explained 3 different struggles that surrounded Pronera, right? But there are many, many more. In the first struggle to even get Pronera, the MST had to put 100,000 people in the streets. In the second struggle to get higher educational access, they had to find a local ally, but even with that local ally, there were tons and tons of conflicts that developed. And then in the third struggle, even with a leftist national government, the MST had to constantly defend Pronera from external attacks. Thus, again, institutionalization was never a freezing in the time of the MST's education proposal, but rather a dynamic process that required both mobilization and political maneuvering to push forward institutional goals. And of course, the second argument is that the case of Pronera shows that occupying formal institutions can help to build a movement's organizational and leadership capacity and resource base. In a short decade, thousands of MST leaders obtained higher education degrees, including 59 activists that graduated from a law degree program and are now activist lawyers in the movement. Thus, I would argue that Pronera defies the claim that it is not possible to compel concessions from elites that can be used as resources to sustain oppositional organization over time. In direct contrast, Pronera has integrated new activists into the movement, increased activists' political and technical knowledge, and allowed movement activists to prefigure in our current world the types of educational and economic initiatives they hope to build in the future. And I wish I could end there. Do you all have 5 more minutes just to talk a little bit about the current context? Okay. So again, I wish I could end in the slide before, but as you all know, ethnography is a moving target, and politics in Brazil have definitely moved right. Again, as you know, in 2016, Dilma Rousseff was pushed out of office, and her new political enemy, Michel Temer, quickly became president, implementing tons of austerity policies that quickly affected the working class. Then in October 2018, the global rise of authoritarian populism hit Brazil hard with the election of Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain who just weeks before had been a fringe candidate, known primarily for his exuberant endorsement of dictatorship, assassination, and torture, his virulent misogyny, homophobia and racism, his loathing of the poor, and his catastrophic environmental policies. So for a country that had really become known globally for its participatory democracy and vibrant social movements, the election of Bolsonaro was confusing, surprising, and really downright scary. The effects of this right-wing resurgence have already influenced the MST. There's been a general attack on workers through austerity policies. There's been an increase in coercive attempts to repress the movement. There's been a passing of a policy that actually privatizes settlements so that people in settlements no longer qualify for public resources. And there's been cuts in funding that supported the MST's economic educational initiatives. I'm sure you guessed it, there's been the complete end of Pronera. And so these are some very serious consequences. However, what I want to leave you with today is that there are still some reasons for cautious optimism about the MST's future in this new political context. So I'm going to leave you with 4 reasons for cautious optimism. The first is that, and I want to be careful with this one, but although Bolsonaro said that a welcome mat for a land invasion was going to be a bullet, his administration has actually not yet used that tactic of invoking the police, either the police or the military, to repress social movements in Brazil. Instead, Bolsonaro's strategy has been to starve the programs that previously supported the movement and to use legal tactics to attack the MST's agricultural and educational institutions. Most recently, the federal government has been trying to shut down the Paulo Freire Institute in Northeast Brazil, but that case is going through the courts, and it's not clear that Bolsonaro is going to win that case. And so if this continues to be the strategy, the MST might be able to ride out that strategy. A second reason for cautious optimism is untamed disruption. The rise of the PT had really split the left in Brazil, but now with the PT out of power, the MST no longer has to play a political dance with the government. It can just protest. And so With the PTs falling out of power for the first time in 2 decades, most left groups in Brazil are actually together in 2 popular fronts that are fighting austerity policies. So a common enemy can unite the left. A third reason for optimism is youth. So today's MST is a movement of young people who grew up in settlements and have participated in MST activities. And although a lot of these young people have migrated to cities, thousands remain on settlements and will prove critical to the long-term sustainability of the movement. This young woman, Olivia, I just visited her in December. She's 17 and still a big MST supporter. And finally, and this is the big argument of the book, is that the MST is now engaging in this contentious political struggle with a new arsenal of material, ideological, and socio-political resources. So in the case of agriculture, the movement has already redistributed land to hundreds of thousands of families, and they've also set up agricultural cooperatives throughout the country, which initially needed federal support to survive, but now are part of local economies. And again, only if Bolsonaro really becomes an authoritarian repressive regime can he get rid of these already successful economic initiatives. Second, let's take the case of Pronera. Again, tens of thousands of students have already graduated from this program, and Bolsonaro cannot erase those degrees and those experiences. Furthermore, Pronera, during the PT's government, inspired another initiative called a Bachelorette and Teaching Certification in Education of the Countryside, which is an undergrad bachelor's degree that the PT institutionalized in 40 universities with 10 tenure-track faculty at every single university, and they continue to exist in all the federal universities across the country. And finally, most of the schools and MST settlements aren't actually controlled by the federal government, but rather the state and municipal governments throughout the country. And although Bolsonaro won the election in 2018, he lost in most of the north and northeastern states. And in many of these states, the governors, who are sort of leftist, are now willing to support the MST more than ever before as a form of resistance against Bolsonaro. So in the state of Ceará, after Bolsonaro got elected, the government agreed to create 4 new massive high schools in MST settlements. And of course, even more than these political opportunities are the actual activists in these schools. The activists who are teaching in these schools, all of these people you see on the screen have all gotten their higher education degree through Pronera. And so these activists really know what they're fighting for because they lived it. And so I really think these Pronera programs became what the late Eric Olin Wright called real utopias, which allowed MST education activists to envision the contours of an alternative social world that embodies emancipatory ideals. Thus, these local activists now have a clear educational vision and a degree to legitimize it. And I really promise I just have one last ethnographic vignette and then I'm done, okay? So in September 2015, at a gathering of 1,200 teachers in Brasilia, MST national leader Jean Pedro Stedley exhorted the crowd. The working class needs to organize its class project, and in order to do this, we have to organize in all spaces of political life. He said, some people do not understand power. They think we can just take the presidential palace and then have power, but there is nowhere in Brazil with less power than the presidential palace. The crowd laughed at the remark, all too appropriate as thousands of people across the country were calling for President Rousseff's impeachment. Then Jean Pedro pointed to a picture of Gramsci in the back of the auditorium. We prefer to follow Gramsci, who says that the people have to create their own social projects and contest power in all spaces of social life: the school, the land, the Senate, and the presidential palace. We are here this week to discuss how to continue one single chapter of our struggle: the conquest of knowledge and education. So in conclusion, the Long March to the Institutions has never been about electing public officials. It's a much deeper form of engaging the state, which involves creating your alternative social practices in all state institutions and social spheres. Again, the MST arose during a dictatorship, got most of its gains during a right-wing national government. And although Lula coming to power offered more opportunities at the national level, it did not change the MST strategy of finding different spheres within the state to push through their goals. Now with a neo-fascist ultra-right government, the movement's going to have to defend gains and find subnational arrangements to keep moving forward with its political, educational, economic goals. And so now is the test. We're going to see the real pros, cons, limits, and strengths of the long march to institutions. So I think all eyes should be on Brazil, because this country is definitely going to affect the rest of Latin America. So thank you for hanging in with me. Yeah.